Right. So in my paper, I would like to speak about the processes of Dejudaization, which took part in Karaite, Krymchak, and Tat communities, well, mountain Jewish communities. I think that this topic is discussed in some papers, especially Karaites Dejudaization. There have been monographs about it, but essentially it doesn't seem that anyone has really tried to deeply and analytically analyze these three types of Dejudaization on a comparative level. So let me try to do it in frames of this paper. So I'm going to talk what is Dejudaization? Dejudaization is the loss of Jewish identity. Essentially, people often think that the loss of the loss of ethnic identity is something very unusual, but in fact it is not. Doesn't mean which country we are talking about, which people we are talking about. It happens quite often. Even in Russia, for example, there are some marginal groups that claim that they are not Russians, or that claim some strange sort of identity, like, for example, some Cossacks claim that they are in fact descendants of the Khazars. Or I remember listening to a fantastic paper during one conference in Moscow, and this paper was dedicated to evolution of ethnic identity of a certain village, which all of a sudden inhabitants of this village started claiming that they are not Russians, but they're inhabitants of this village with their own history, language, and traditions, and they're not really a part of the Russian people anymore. So such things as the loss of ethnic identity, they do happen. It's not really something completely unusual. It's always very interesting, because it is indeed very interesting. Why all of a sudden a part of German nation starts losing German identity and becomes a different part, a group with a different identity. Here, for example, I speak about the case of so-called Wilmesayev, or inhabitants of the Polish town of Wilamowice, who were ethnic Germans who, in the course of the drastic 20th century, started losing their German identity and developed a new Wilamowician identity. And anyway, such things do happen. To my knowledge, within the Jewish people or the Jewish nation, doesn't matter how we call what term we use, I think there are only 3 cases of this type, and these are named East European Karaites. It is very important to emphasize that I'm talking here exclusively about the Karaites of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Russia. I'm not talking about Near Eastern Karaites. Near Eastern Karaites, Karaites of Iraq, Egypt, and, well, Israeli, Eretz Israel, they never lost their Jewish identity. I'm talking exclusively about East European Karaites, and specifically about the Crimean ones. So the second group is Krymchaki Jews of the Crimea. They are very unusual, interesting community of Turkic-speaking, or one may say Tatar-speaking Jews of the Crimea, who lived there at least from the 13th century, who had very unusual traditions, and again in the 20th century lost their Jewish identity. And the third group that I'm going to talk about are the mountain Jews of the Caucasus, who started losing their identity also in course of the 20th century and began calling themselves Tats and started developing a new non-Jewish identity. So in terms of chronology, the Karaite case, in general, Karaite case perhaps is the most interesting, the most unusual, the most developed case. And chronologically, it began at least in the 1860s. So before that, the Karaites also began dissociating themselves from other Jews living in the Crimea, both Krymchaki Jews and so-called Polish Jews, so Ashkenazim who came to the Crimea. But it was only in the end of the 1860s that they, for the first time, started saying basically, we ethnically are not Jews, we are descendants of the Khazars, so we are Turks. So the Tats began developing their non-Jewish identity roughly from the 1930s. At least I don't really know of any manifestation of non-Jewish identity among the mountain Jews of the Caucasus before the 1930s. The Krymchaks also, well, let me come back to the Tat case just for a second. So they started speaking about it in the 1930s, but actively they began using this non-Jewish identity only in the 1950s for understandable reasons, the growth of official anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism in the Soviet Union. And the same with the Krymchaks. Essentially, they started actively advocating their non-Jewish origin only in the 1950s. So what kind of Dejudaizations these were? So the Karaite case was certainly the strongest, the most thought of. It dates back to the 1860s. It's very elaborate case of Dejudaization. It is based not only on mythology and on myths, but even on academic works written by Karaite and non-Karaite scholars alike. And what is also highly interesting, it is also based partly on falsified written and epigraphic sources. And this is, I think, something very unique in the history of European nationalism. I mean, okay, falsified written sources. Okay, again, it's something unusual, but it's one can find similar cases in other ethnic groups and nationalisms. But falsifying epigraphic sources, this is something very unusual and specific, perhaps exclusively to the Karaites. Okay, essence of Karaite Dejudaization. They present themselves as people of Turkic origin, descendants of the Khazars who embraced Judaism in the Middle Ages, or perhaps descendants even of earlier Turkic and Altai peoples. They speak the Turkic Karaim language. They say that their religion is not a Judaism, but is a mixture of pagan, Islamic, Christian, and Judaic practices. Krymchak Dejudaization. Their Dejudaization is much weaker. Not every member of Krymchak community accepted it, whereas with Karaite community, it's almost East European Karaite community, it was almost unanimous process of accepting this identity. Only perhaps isolated individual families did not accept this myth of their Khazar origin. With Krymchaks, it was really different. Their Dejudaization was much weaker. Not everyone accepted it. Many Krymchaks emigrated to Israel. It became perhaps especially strong in the 1990s and 2000s, largely under the influence of two charismatic leaders, of historian Igor Ashkenazi and philologist David Rebbe. Essence of their Dejudaization. They presented themselves as the people of Turkic origin, descendants of the Khazars who embraced Judaism in the Middle Ages. Okay, Rebbe said they also descendants of Altai peoples, but this concept was hardly accepted by other Krymchaki national leaders. There was also the concept, it was supported largely by Igor Ashkenazi, that in fact, the Krymchaks represent a mixture of different peoples who embraced Judaism starting from the 1st century AD, let's say some Greek and Roman slaves who accepted, who were slaves of the Jews and accepted Judaism. Then there came Khazars, then there came some Jews, and they became this sort of amalgamated community, largely of Turkic origin, but including also some other ethnic groups. So according to these nationalists, Krymchak nationalists, the Krymchak speak the separate Turkic Krymchak language, not a dialect of the Crimean or ethnoloct of the Crimean Tatar language, and their religion is also a mixture of pagan and Judaic practices, but still it's so to say it's closer to Judaism, whereas Karaites, they claim that it's not Judaism at all, only some vague elements of Jewish practices. The Tats, perhaps their Dejudaization was the weakest. It was much less based on historical mythology. Many Tats emigrated and never lost their identity. Still, it did take place and was quite active in the 1970s, 1960s, 1980s, and even after the 1991, when most of the Tats simply emigrated to Israel. Essence of their Dejudaization: to present themselves as Iranian people, speaking the Iranian Tat language. Another version is that they are also some sort of autochthonous Caucasian group that at some point accepted Judaism as a religion. They claim that their religion is Judaism, but with a mixture of some local pagan practices. What are the common features of these Dejudaizations? First of all these three Dejudaizations were developed under the influence both internal and external factors. So on the one hand, there was state anti-Semitism, both in Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which influenced the process of their Dejudaization. On the other hand, there was a big inner impetus within the community to get rid of this obsolete and useless Jewishness and adopt this new identity, non-Jewish identity. Another common feature of these three Dejudaizations. These Dejudaizations began from the process of distancing themselves from the newcomers. This is how Ashkenazic Jews were perceived. So each of these groups was saying, we are separate group, we are Karaites, Krymchaks, and Tats, and they are Jews. Not Ashkenazic Jews, but simply as Jews. So this is how it began. Мы Караимы, они евреи. Мы Крымчаки, они евреи. Мы Таты, они евреи. Sorry for switching to Russian for a second, but just to demonstrate how it really worked within their mentality. Another important common feature, changing the traditional ethnic name to a local community name, which begins to be used as the only self-appellation. Again, original name of the Karaite Jews were Karaite Jews, Yehudim Karaim, Евреи Karaime, whatever. Then they switched only to Karaime, only to Karaites, and today, from the 1990s, there is a tendency among the most radical Crimean Turkic Karaites to call themselves not even Karaime, but Karai. So something, or Karailar in Turkic languages. So in order to distance themselves from the Jews even further than that. Among the Krymchaks, again the same. I mean, they were calling themselves Krymsky Евреи, Krymchaki, something of this type. But then they switched only to Krymchaki, and again, this is a very important role in the process of Dejudaization, using this kind of non-Jewish ethnonym to define your own community. The same with mountain Jews. Горские евреи, suddenly started calling themselves just Tate, and Tate or Tats, and they began insisting on, for example, writing in this so-called fifth point in fifth line in Soviet passports, where you were supposed to indicate your nationality. They started saying, please don't write there the word Yevgeny, please write the word Tati. And the same with Krymchaks, actually. They also began insisting on writing the name Krymchaki in their Soviet passports. Another common feature, inventing myths about their extremely ancient arrival in the areas where they lived. There were Karaite myths about their arrival to the Crimea during the time of the 10 lost tribes and ancient Judeans. Later, these myths were replaced with the myths about their origin from the Khazars and Altai peoples. Krymchaks, again, they were speaking about their arrival at least in the 1st century AD during the Greek, Gothic, and Khazar times, or even references to Altai peoples. The Tats, they also developed the theory about their arrival to the Caucasus together with the ancient Persians during the time of the King Darius and so on. So again, it's like prehistoric times. One more common feature, the impact of the Holocaust. Essentially, all of these three types of Dejudaization were heavily influenced by the events of the Holocaust. Obviously, Holocaust was the mortal danger. And if you look at your the people being killed just because they happen to have Jewish name, surname, and Jewish identity, obviously this is a great stimulus for you to lose your own identity. And essentially the process of the Dejudaization of these three groups was finished perhaps only in the 1950s. So largely as the result of the Holocaust. Another common feature, myths about the non-Jewish proselyte origin of their community. One more common feature, tendency to depict your members of your community as stupid and ignorant. That's very funny, because normally every nationalist says, my nation, my people are the cleverest, the best literateurs, the best writers, poets, musicians, whatsoever. But not in the case of the Dejudaization. They say our ancestors were so stupid and ignorant that they could not understand Hebrew and all the details, all the Jewish practices, and especially the Talmud. This is really common to all this Dejudaization, and this is something very unusual and very interesting. One more common feature, search for the alleged and in fact obviously non-existent pagan religious practices. For the Karaites is the cult of the of the pagan Turkic deity Tengri. The same for the Krymchaks. They also pretend to be followers of Tengri. But the Karaites also invented the cult of the so-called sacred oaks. So even, so to say, like Druids, like Celts, and so on. With the Tats, it was different. Okay, some nationalists, Tat nationalists also said that there were some pagan practices and so on, but in general, they could not really deny that mountain Jews, were Jewish believers. Emphasis that Hebrew was not the language of their ancestors was not the native language of their ancestors. They usually say that our native language is a local vernacular. For the Karaites, it is something that they call the Karaim language, although it's rather, at least for the Crimean Karaites, it's rather ethnolect of the Crimean Tatar. For the Krymchaks, it is the so-called Krymchak language. Again, it's rather not a language, but dialect of Crimean Tatar, ethnolect of the Crimean Tatar language. And for the Tats, it's Iranic language, the so-called Tat language, which can be called perhaps Judea Tat language. Very interesting feature that usually they try to stop using Hebrew religious terminology, and usually the first reform of this linguistic reform of this type begins with the inventing of a new name for a synagogue. Thus, the Karaites pretend that their houses of prayer are not synagogues, but something that should be called Knesset. The Krymchaks say that their houses of prayer are called not synagogues but kahal, and the Tats say that their synagogues are in fact should be called numaz. One more feature is trying to lobby their interest on a political level. I'm about to finish. I would like to say just one word about today's situation with this process of Dejudaization. Basically, the process of Dejudaization of the Karaites and Krymchaks was extremely strong in the 1990s, 2000s, but now it's coming, I would say, very optimistically that it is coming to its logical end. And the same with Tats. Essentially, today's mountain Jews started understanding that it's essentially better to be Jews. Okay, there are some, for obvious reasons, support from Israel as a state, although still there is a certain group which claim that they're Tats. They even have their own representative in the state Soviet parliament in Dagestan. So still there are some people Tats who still support this non-Jewish identity, but let's say their numbers are growing fewer and fewer. The Karaites. Again, my impression that in general one can clearly witness the process of Judaization of the Karaite community, especially in the Crimea, where a number of the Karaites really started thinking about themselves as Jews, started learning Hebrew, started practicing circumcision, started praying in Hebrew. Again, this process is not has not been finished yet. For example, even religious Karaites living in Yevpatoria who go to Knesset, as they say, to a synagogue and pray there, still they say, okay, our religion is kind of Karaite Judaism, but still ethnically we are descendants of the Khazars. But still my impression that this Turkic lobby within the Karaite community is getting weaker and weaker with every day, partly because the main supporter, the main lobbyist of this idea, Yuri Polkanov, died about 2 or 3 years ago. So, and they don't have as charismatic leader who can really be equal to Polkanov. The same I can say about the Krymchaks. They lost their 2 charismatic leaders, Ashkenazi and Rebbe, and afterwards, my impression, they're gradually coming back to understanding themselves as a part of their Jewish nation. They stopped being so much afraid when you use the word Yevi or the word synagogue. Recently, we published, under my editorship, we published together with the Krymchaks a big volume in Simferopol, which has texts in the Hebrew language, and it seems that again that their process of their Dejudaization is coming to the logical end. Although still there are some Krymchaks that say, no, we are descendants of the Khazars and so on. That's roughly what I wanted to say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for this fascinating talk and fascinating ideas. And I can say personally, as someone who studied these issues with respect to the Holocaust, that the idea was and is very much in the air. You've just managed to sum it up analytically. Extremely interesting, even though I can tell you that not everyone in Israel and in the Jewish world would clap his hands, after hearing such a presentation. I can tell you that once I participated in a conference on the Mountain Jews here in Israel, and the first speaker was a Sephardi chief rabbi, and he spoke something like 40 minutes praising Mountain Jews for preserving their Jewish roots. And I remember it pretty well because it's because of him that I was given only 5 minutes to talk instead of 15 minutes. But the very idea that someone will be praised 40 minutes for preserving, for emphasizing his Jewishness seems a bit, strange to me, because, 40 minutes, after all, more or less, no one would praise Ashkenazi Jews for preserving, for remaining Jews. It's self-evident. And, but they liked it. And, I remember it pretty well until now. So there was something in the air. And I even remember that when I talked about the Mountain Jews as viewed by Nazi Germany, and essentially they started viewing them as non-Jews, the audience looked at me as if I were the enemy of the people. I repeatedly said that it was their point of view, not mine. Didn't work. So even though it was a scholarly event, it was, so I can only imagine how your idea would be perceived in such places, but this is scholarship. Okay. Okay, on this happy note, I will be happy to give, to hear those who would like to ask questions. If there are,
Yes. There is Professor Shapiro would like to ask a question. I see him raising his hand.
Thank you for your presentation. As you know, I addressed some of these issues in my paper published in a book edited by Professor Achiezer and Professor Enoch. But I'd like to ask two questions. Why do you think that the question of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish attitude is so central for one's de-Judaization? After all, the anti-Semitism or Judophobic feelings were always around. Why did it happen in these three cases? This is one question. My second question is, why did it not happen with other non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union? The Jews of Georgia, and be Central Asian Jews, commonly known as Bukharan Jews. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Yes, obviously, I mean, the question of Karaite Dejudaization is not new. It's analyzed by many people from different perspectives. In my paper, I wanted just to make really a comparative analysis, not inventing a new thing. First of all, about the role of anti-Semitism. Well, it is obvious, I guess, even if we compare Karaites living in Eastern Europe, where they did experience anti-Semitism, and Karaites living in Cairo, where they did not experience anti-Semitism, at least not until the 1950s. So the Karaites living in Cairo did not have any so to say, any motive to lose their Jewish identity. They were perfectly all right being surrounded by the Arabs because, well, there was virtually no anti-Semitism there. Whereas in Eastern Europe...
It's not true. It's not true.
Well, okay, anti-Semitism was much weaker, at least so to say. At least this is my impression from what I read about it.
No. Go to the San Francisco Bay Area and try to ask people of Karaite Egyptian origins if they will want to talk to you. You will hear horrible stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know, at least from what I read, from what I heard, at least my impression that they didn't really experience anti-Semitism. But okay, anyway, anti-Semitism is indeed a very...
Excuse me, please. It was so horrible that they don't dare to talk about it.
Okay, maybe the case, but Shimon Shishman at least had a completely different idea about that. He claimed that they had fantastic relations with the Arabs until the Israelis came and told them that they are Jews. But okay, that's a different story. Shishman himself is a very curious person. But anyway, I mean, okay, coming back to Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism did play a very important role. But why it worked, let's say, for these three groups, and it didn't work, let's say, for Ashkenazic Jews? I think largely because of the fact that these three groups represented really minor communities, and they could really use their exoticness, so to say. I think exoticness is a very good word for this. I even wanted to write once a project about it. So they wanted to use their unusual origin, let's say the fact that they spoke Turkic language, the fact that they were dressed as Tatars, as one of the factors which would help them to present themselves to the government as first as different type of Jews, better Jews than these newcomers from Poland or Russia. Then there was the second phase of Dejudaization. They started saying that we are sort of Jews, but we are Karaites or Krymchaks. And the third stage was already post-Holocaust stage, or let's say 1930s, when they started really saying we are not Jews at all, but we are Turks, we are descendants of the Khazars. So my impression that it worked really within these three cases for a number of reasons. One of them was really their exoticness. Second, their ability to lobby their interests on a political level. They had, at least if we speak about the Karaites, they had fantastic lobbyists like Firkovich and then later Seraya Shapshal, who was a very famous person himself, who had very good political contacts, and it was largely him who invented the new identity for the Karaites. My impression that the other groups, like you said, that Georgian Jews or Bukharan Jews, they experienced maybe perhaps the same anti-Semitic influence, but they did not happen to have such charismatic, successful leaders, lobbyists, shtadlanim, who managed to invent their new past and new mythology and present it in a very good way to Soviet or to Russian administration. At least this is my idea. Yes.
No. The Georgian Jews and the Bukharan Jews have developed their own mythology, which are no less strange than the mythologies produced by the groups you talked about. But these mythologies were absolutely pro-Jewish. They are Jewish.
Yeah, that's about it. I mean, their leaders, for some reason, decided to remain Jews, and these folks decided to stop.
But why? Why? Why here no and here yes?
It's very difficult to say. I think it's like you can. I don't know. It's really very kind of subjective problem. It's roughly why, let's say, you came from the Soviet Union having your Jewish identity, and Golda did the same, and Kirill did the same, you know, and Yelena did the same, whereas a number of my friends who live in the Soviet Union did not do this. I don't know, for some reason they don't want to be Jews, although their parents are Jewish, they look Jewish, they have Jewish surnames, but they say we are Russians. Roughly, something of this type happened. They decided for some reason to stop being Jewish, and they were successful in it.
May I add a short remark?
Yes.
About the question about the anti-Semitism of Karaites. I think it's the same questions like about the anti-Semitism of Jews who converted into Islam or Christianity. And it's the same questions, why they did it, why some of them converted and the others didn't. I'm not sure that anyone can give a concrete answer on these questions. And it's quite a similar situation.